You were never meant to notice this, at least not in the way you are beginning to now. And yet, here you are, standing in a moment where something subtle but undeniable has started to surface in your awareness. Something that does not scream for attention, but quietly insists on being seen the more you pay attention to it. It did not begin with something obvious or dramatic. It began with a feeling, a sense that certain things did not fully align, that certain patterns repeated too precisely to be dismissed, that certain people, places, or situations carried a consistency beneath the surface that others seemed to overlook entirely. At first, it may have felt like overthinking, like your mind was connecting dots that did not belong together. But the more you observed, the more those connections held. The more the pattern revealed itself in ways that could not be easily ignored or explained away. This is where your awareness began to separate from the ordinary. Not because you were trying to see something hidden, but because you were willing to look a little deeper than most, to pause where others moved on, to question where others accepted. And that difference, though small at the beginning, is what led you to this point now. There are layers within everyday life that do not present themselves openly, structures that blend so seamlessly into the environment that they become invisible to those who are not looking for them. And yet, they leave traces, subtle signals, patterns that repeat in ways that only become clear when you step back and observe with intention. What you are beginning to sense is not something that can be fully explained in a single moment. It is something that unfolds gradually, revealing itself piece by piece as your awareness continues to sharpen. And while others may move through the same spaces without noticing anything unusual, you are starting to see that there is more beneath the surface, something that operates quietly, something that does not need to be obvious to exist. And this is where your clarity becomes significant. Because you are not just observing randomly, you are recognizing, you are connecting. You are beginning to understand that what you are seeing is part of a larger pattern, one that was always there but required a certain level of awareness to perceive. This does not mean everything is what it first appears to be, but it does mean that your ability to notice, to question, and to look deeper has brought you into a space where your perception is no longer limited to the surface. And once that shift happens, it cannot be undone. Because you are no longer seeing the world in the same way. You are seeing through it. And that changes everything. And it started in a way so subtle that if you had not been paying attention, you would have dismissed it like every other small irregularity that passes through daily life unnoticed. Because at first, there was no clear evidence, no undeniable proof, only a quiet sense that something did not fully align, something that felt slightly out of place in ways that were difficult to explain, but impossible to completely ignore once you noticed it. It may have appeared in conversations where the words sounded normal, but the intention behind them felt misaligned. In interactions where the behavior seemed consistent on the surface, yet carried an undercurrent that did not match the situation. In environments that looked ordinary, but held a pattern of repetition that felt too precise to be random. These were not dramatic moments, not the kind that demand immediate action, but the kind that linger just long enough to plant a question in your mind. A question that does not disappear even when you try to move on. At first, you may have told yourself that it was nothing, that you were reading too much into things, that your mind was simply connecting dots that did not belong together. Because that is the easiest explanation when something cannot be immediately confirmed, and it allows you to return to the comfort of what feels normal. But something in you did not fully accept that explanation. Something kept bringing your attention back to those moments, not in a forceful way, but in a persistent one, like a quiet signal repeating itself until it is acknowledged. And this is where the first shift began. Not in what you saw, but in how you responded to what you saw. Because instead of dismissing it completely, you paused, even if only briefly. You allowed yourself to consider the possibility that what you were noticing might hold some meaning, even if you could not fully understand it yet. That pause, though small, changed everything, because it created space for observation. And observation is where awareness begins to grow. You started to pay attention more closely, not obsessively, but with intention, noticing how certain patterns repeated across different situations, how certain behaviors appeared consistent in ways that did not depend on context, how certain dynamics seemed to follow a structure that was not immediately visible, but became clearer the more you observed it over time. It was not about finding something specific. It was about recognizing that something was there, something that operated beneath the surface of what was considered normal, something that did not need to be obvious to exist. And as you continued to observe, the pattern began to take shape, not all at once, but gradually, like a picture coming into focus piece by piece, where each small detail that once seemed insignificant now connected to a larger understanding that could no longer be ignored. You may have noticed how certain people appeared in specific contexts repeatedly, how certain interactions followed similar scripts even when the circumstances were different, how certain responses seemed rehearsed or too consistent to be spontaneous. And while none of these observations alone would have been enough to draw a conclusion, together they formed a pattern that carried weight, a pattern that suggested intention rather than coincidence. This is where your awareness moved beyond curiosity and into recognition. Because you were no longer just noticing isolated details, you were seeing how they connected, how they reinforced each other, how they pointed towards something that existed beyond what was immediately visible. And this recognition did not come with certainty at first. It came with questions, with a sense of needing to understand more, to observe further, to confirm whether what you were seeing was real or simply a projection of your own perception. But instead of turning away from those questions, you stayed with them. You allowed them to guide your observation rather than shutting them down. And that is what allowed your awareness to deepen. Because you were not forcing conclusions. You were allowing understanding to emerge through consistent attention. There were moments where the pattern became more apparent, where something you noticed aligned too clearly with something that happened later, where a sense you had about a situation was confirmed in ways that felt too precise to ignore. And each of those moments strengthened your trust in your perception, not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in a steady, accumulating way that built confidence over time. You began to realize that what you were noticing was not random, that there was a structure to it, a logic that could be followed if you paid attention closely enough. And that realization shifted how you engaged with everything around you. Because you were no longer just experiencing events as they happened. You were observing how they formed, how they repeated, how they connected to something larger than the individual moment. This is where your perception began to separate from the surface level. Because while others may have continued to move through the same situations without noticing anything unusual, you were starting to see the underlying patterns that gave those situations their shape. And once you see that, it changes how you interpret everything that follows. You are no longer reacting to what is presented. You are analyzing what is beneath it. You are recognizing that what appears on the surface is often only a part of a larger structure that operates quietly, consistently, and often unnoticed by those who are not looking for it. And as this awareness continued to develop, you may have felt a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Because seeing something that others do not immediately recognize can feel isolating at times, can make you question whether your perception is accurate, or whether you are simply interpreting things differently than those around you. But the consistency of what you observed did not fade. It did not disappear when you tried to ignore it. It remained, repeating in ways that reinforced itself. And that consistency is what allowed you to move beyond doubt, not by eliminating questions entirely, but by recognizing that what you were seeing had a structure that could not be easily dismissed. You did not rush to conclusions. You did not jump to assumptions without observation. You allowed the pattern to reveal itself over time, and that patience is what made your awareness reliable. Because it was not built on impulse, it was built on consistent recognition of what was actually there. And this is the moment where everything begins to shift. Because you are no longer seeing isolated events, you are seeing a system of patterns. And once that system becomes visible, even partially, it changes how you move, how you think, how you interpret everything that follows. Because you are no longer limited to what is immediately presented. You are engaging with a deeper level of understanding that continues to unfold the more you pay attention. And that unfolding is not something that can be reversed, because once you recognize that there is more beneath the surface, you cannot return to seeing only what is on top. You begin to look deeper automatically, to question more naturally, to observe more intentionally. And that shift, though it began quietly, is what sets everything else in motion. And as your awareness continued to expand beyond those first subtle signs, what began to unfold was not just a series of isolated patterns, but the realization that many of these patterns were not random at all. They were part of structures that exist quietly within everyday life. Structures that do not present themselves as unusual or hidden because they are designed to appear ordinary, to blend so seamlessly into the environment that they become almost impossible to distinguish from what people accept as normal. This is where your perception begins to deepen in a different way. Because you are no longer just noticing irregularities, you are beginning to understand that what you are seeing operates within a framework. One that does not rely on being visible to function. One that thrives precisely because it does not draw attention to itself. You may have started to notice how certain places, interactions, or systems carry a kind of consistency that goes beyond coincidence. How certain behaviors repeat not just occasionally, but with a rhythm that suggests coordination rather than randomness. How certain environments seem to influence behavior in ways that feel structured, even if they are not explicitly defined. At first, this realization may have felt difficult to process, because it challenges the assumption that everything around you is simply a collection of independent events. But as you continue to observe, the connections become clearer. Not in a way that overwhelms you, but in a way that gradually shifts your understanding of how things operate beneath the surface. You begin to see that influence does not always come in obvious forms. It does not always announce itself or make its presence known directly. Often, it works through patterns, through repetition, through subtle reinforcement of behaviors that feel natural because they are familiar, not because they are independent. And this is where the idea of hidden structures becomes important, not as something dramatic or exaggerated, but as something functional, something that exists because it is effective, something that does not need to be seen to have an impact. You start to recognize how environments shape behavior, how certain systems guide decisions without appearing to do so, how patterns can be maintained simply by being repeated often enough that they are no longer questioned. And this recognition changes how you interpret what is happening around you, because you are no longer taking everything at face value. You are looking at how it fits into a larger pattern, how it connects to what you have already observed, how it reinforces or contradicts the structures you are beginning to perceive. This does not mean everything is controlled or intentional in a rigid sense, but it does mean that there are layers of organization that are not immediately visible. layers that influence how things unfold in ways that are subtle but consistent. And as you begin to see this more clearly, you also begin to understand why most people do not notice it. Because it does not present itself as something separate from everyday life. It is embedded within it. It is part of the normal flow of interactions, decisions, and behaviors that people move through without needing to question. And without the habit of observation that you have developed, it is easy to move through these patterns without ever recognizing them. This is where your awareness becomes even more significant, because you are not just seeing the surface, you are seeing the structure beneath it. And that structure provides context for everything else. It explains why certain things repeat, why certain outcomes occur in predictable ways, why certain dynamics feel familiar, even in different situations. You may begin to notice how the same types of interactions occur in different environments, how the same patterns of behavior appear across different groups of people, how the same responses are triggered by similar conditions. And this repetition is what reveals the presence of underlying structures. Because true randomness does not repeat with consistency, but systems do, patterns do, structures do. And as you continue to observe this, you may also begin to see how these structures maintain themselves, not through force, but through familiarity, through the natural tendency of people to follow what feels known, what feels comfortable, what feels accepted. And this is why they are so effective, because they do not need to be enforced directly. They are reinforced through repetition, through normalization, through the absence of questioning. But your awareness disrupts that process, not by opposing it directly, but by recognizing it. Because once a pattern is seen, it cannot operate in the same way on the person who sees it. It may still exist, it may still function, but its influence is reduced because it is no longer unconscious. It is no longer invisible. You are no longer moving through these structures blindly. You are moving through them with awareness, and that awareness changes your relationship to them. It allows you to choose rather than simply follow, to observe rather than automatically engage, to recognize when something aligns with your understanding and when it does not. This is where your perception shifts from passive to active, because you are no longer just experiencing reality. You are interpreting it, understanding it, navigating it with a level of awareness that was not present before. And while this may feel complex at times, it also brings a sense of clarity. Because once you begin to understand the structures beneath the surface, the world becomes more coherent. Not necessarily simpler, but more understandable, more predictable in its patterns, even if the details continue to change. You are no longer surprised by certain outcomes because you can see the patterns that lead to them. You are no longer confused by certain behaviors because you can recognize the structures that shape them. And this understanding allows you to move with greater confidence. Not because you control everything, but because you understand how things operate at a deeper level. And as this awareness continues to grow, you may also begin to notice how your presence within these structures changes, how you are no longer influenced in the same way, how your decisions begin to diverge from what is expected, how your responses no longer follow the same patterns that once guided them. And this divergence is not something you force. It is a natural result of your awareness. Because once you see a pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to participate in it unconsciously. You may still engage with the same environments, the same systems, the same interactions, but you do so differently, with intention, with choice, with an understanding that allows you to navigate rather than be guided without awareness. And this is where your clarity becomes a form of independence. Not in a way that isolates you, but in a way that frees you from unconscious influence, allowing you to move through the same world as others while experiencing it in a fundamentally different way. You are not separate from reality. You are engaging with it more deeply, more consciously, more intentionally. And that is what sets you apart. Not what you see, but how you see it. Not where you are, but how you move within it. And that shift is what continues to unfold as you move forward, revealing more layers, more patterns, more understanding with each step you take. And as these hidden structures begin to take shape in your awareness, the question naturally arises, not in a loud or forceful way, but in a quiet, persistent way that lingers beneath your observations, asking why you were able to see this when so many others continue to move through the same environments without noticing anything unusual. And this is where your attention turns inward. Not to doubt what you are seeing, but to understand the part of you that made this recognition possible in the first place. You begin to realize that it was not a single moment that gave you this clarity, not a sudden realization that appeared out of nowhere, but a series of small shifts in how you perceive, how you observe, how you engage with what is in front of you. Shifts that happened gradually over time, often without you fully recognizing their significance, until they began to accumulate into something undeniable. There was a point where you stopped accepting things at face value as easily as before, where you started to notice inconsistencies that others dismissed, where you felt a subtle pull to look deeper rather than move on. And that pull, though easy to ignore at first, became stronger the more you followed it, the more you allowed yourself to pause, to question, to observe without immediately jumping to conclusions or explanations that would bring you back to a place of comfort. This is where your awareness began to differentiate itself, not because you were trying to see something hidden, but because you were willing to remain present with what did not immediately make sense. And that willingness is what opened the door to deeper perception. Most people move quickly through their experiences, not because they are incapable of seeing more, but because the pace of life encourages surface-level engagement, encourages immediate interpretation, encourages conclusions that allow them to move forward without needing to linger in uncertainty. But you did something different, even if unconsciously at first. You stayed with the moment a little longer. You allowed questions to exist without forcing answers. You observed patterns over time instead of reacting to isolated events. And that difference, though subtle, is what created the foundation for the awareness you now carry. You were not given this perception. You developed it. Through repetition, through consistency, through a quiet discipline of attention that most people do not maintain long enough for it to fully form. There were times when it would have been easier to ignore what you noticed, easier to accept the simplest explanation and move on, easier to align with what everyone else seemed to believe without question. But something in you resisted that, not out of defiance, but out of recognition that there was more to understand, more to see, more to connect. And each time you chose to follow that recognition instead of dismissing it, you strengthened your ability to perceive, to distinguish, to understand beyond the surface. This is why your awareness feels different now, because it is not based on a single insight. It is based on a pattern of observation that has been reinforced over time. A way of engaging with reality that allows you to see connections that others overlook. Not because they are not there, but because they are not being looked for in the same way. You may have noticed how your mind processes information differently now, how you naturally look for patterns, how you connect details that seem unrelated at first glance, how you sense the direction of a situation before it fully unfolds. And this is not something that requires effort in the way it once might have. It happens naturally, because your awareness has been trained to operate in this way. And this is where you begin to understand that what you are experiencing is not unusual in the sense of being unnatural. It is simply uncommon because it requires a level of attention and consistency that most people do not maintain. Not because they cannot, but because they have not been guided to do so. Because the environment they move in does not encourage it. Because the pace of their lives does not allow for it. Because the habits they have formed do not support it. But you moved differently, even when you did not fully understand why. You allowed yourself to notice, to question, to remain present with what others moved past. And that is what allowed your perception to expand beyond the surface. There is also a deeper layer to this, one that goes beyond observation and into intuition, into the subtle signals that you began to recognize, not just through what you see, but through what you feel, through a sense of alignment or misalignment that does not always have an immediate explanation, but proves itself accurate over time. You may have experienced moments where something felt off without being able to explain why. Moments where you sensed a pattern before you could fully articulate it. Moments where your understanding arrived before your reasoning caught up. And at first, this may have felt uncertain, even unreliable. But as those moments continued to align with what later became clear, you began to trust them, not blindly, but through experience, through repeated confirmation that what you sensed held truth. This is where your perception becomes more than analytical. It becomes integrated, combining observation with intuition, logic with recognition, allowing you to see in a way that is both structured and fluid, both grounded and adaptive. And this integration is what makes your awareness so effective, because it does not rely on a single method. It is flexible, responsive, capable of adjusting to new information while maintaining its core clarity. You are not locked into one way of understanding. You are able to see from multiple angles, to connect different layers of information, to recognize patterns that exist across different contexts. And this ability is what allows you to navigate complexity without becoming overwhelmed by it. You may still encounter moments where things are not immediately clear, where patterns take time to reveal themselves, where new situations require you to observe before understanding. But you approach these moments differently now, not with frustration, but with patience, with the understanding that clarity emerges through observation, not through force. You are no longer trying to make sense of everything instantly. You are allowing understanding to develop, to form naturally as you continue to engage with what is in front of you. And this patience is part of what keeps your awareness aligned, because it prevents you from jumping to conclusions that are not yet supported by the patterns you observe. And as you continue to refine this, you begin to see that your perception is not just a tool for understanding the world. It is a guide for how you move within it, influencing your decisions, your interactions, your direction in ways that are consistent with the level of awareness you have developed. You are not just seeing more. You are moving differently because of what you see, choosing paths that align with your understanding, avoiding patterns that you recognize as unaligned, engaging with situations in a way that reflects the clarity you carry. And this is where everything begins to align, not in a way that eliminates all uncertainty, but in a way that gives you a stable foundation to navigate it. Because you are no longer relying on external cues alone to guide you. You are using your own awareness, your own perception, your own understanding as a reference point that remains consistent even as everything else continues to change. And this is why you were able to see what others did not. Not because you were chosen in a way that excludes others, but because you moved in a way that allowed your awareness to develop, to refine, to expand beyond the surface. And now that you have reached this point, that awareness is something you carry with you. Something that will continue to grow, to deepen, to guide you forward as you continue to observe, to question, and to understand the world in a way that goes beyond what is immediately visible. And as your awareness continues to deepen, and the structures around you become more visible in their patterns and consistency, there comes a moment where the idea of what you once assumed to be valuable begins to shift. Not abruptly, but in a way that gradually redefines how you interpret significance, influence, and what truly carries weight within the environments you move through. Because what initially may have sounded like something literal, something tied to material value or external recognition, begins to reveal itself as something far more subtle and far more powerful. Something that cannot be easily measured or assigned in obvious ways. You begin to understand that the concept of a price in this context is not about currency, not about something that can be traded or quantified in a straightforward manner, but about the level of attention, influence, and perceived impact that awareness itself holds when it reaches a certain depth. What carries value is not what is visible on the surface. It is not what is easily displayed or recognized by everyone. It is the ability to perceive, to understand, to recognize patterns and structures that operate beyond the obvious. Because that kind of awareness changes how you engage with everything, and anything that changes engagement at that level carries significance, whether it is acknowledged openly or not. You may begin to see that clarity itself becomes a form of leverage, not in the sense of control over others, but in the sense that it frees you from being unconsciously guided by patterns you now recognize. And that freedom is what makes it valuable, because it shifts your position from being influenced to being aware of influence, from reacting automatically to responding intentionally. This is where the idea of a price tag becomes more about how awareness is perceived within systems that rely on consistency and predictability. Because anything that introduces variation, anything that disrupts established patterns simply by recognizing them, carries a level of impact that is not always comfortable for those patterns to accommodate. You begin to understand that what you have developed is not something that can be easily replaced or replicated without the same process of observation and refinement. And that uniqueness, not in a personal sense of identity, but in a functional sense of perception, is what gives it weight. It is not about being different for the sake of difference. It is about operating from a level of clarity that does not align with unconscious repetition. And that alignment shift is what changes how you move within any environment. You may notice how your decisions begin to diverge from what is expected, how your responses do not follow the same predictable patterns that once guided them, how your engagement becomes more selective, more intentional, more aligned with what you understand rather than what is simply presented. And this divergence is not something you force. It is a natural result of awareness. Because once you see the structure of a pattern, it becomes difficult to participate in it without recognizing its influence. And that recognition creates space for choice. This is where the true value lies, not in what you possess externally, but in how you perceive and engage internally. Because that internal shift affects everything else, shaping your actions, your direction, your interactions in ways that are consistent with your awareness. You are no longer navigating blindly. You are navigating with understanding. And that understanding cannot be easily taken from you, because it is not dependent on external conditions. It is something that exists within your perception, something that has been built through experience and observation. You may also begin to see how environments respond differently to this kind of awareness, not always in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts, in how certain interactions unfold, in how certain dynamics change when you engage with them, from a place of clarity rather than assumption. It is not that everything around you changes, but your relationship to it does. And that change alters the way those environments interact with you in return. You are no longer as easily influenced by repetition. You are less likely to follow patterns that do not align with your understanding. And this creates a form of independence that is not about separation, but about conscious engagement. And this independence is what makes awareness valuable, because it reduces the level of unconscious influence that can operate without recognition. It introduces a level of discernment that allows you to move through complexity without being controlled by it. You may still encounter the same structures, the same patterns, the same systems, but you engage with them differently, not as something you are bound by, but as something you understand, something you can navigate with intention. This is where your perception becomes not just a tool for observation, but a foundation for action, guiding how you respond, how you choose, how you move forward in ways that are aligned with what you see rather than what is expected. And as this continues to develop, you begin to recognize that the value of this awareness is not something that needs to be validated externally to exist. It is evident in how it changes your experience, in how it allows you to move with clarity even in situations that would have previously created confusion, in how it provides a sense of direction that does not rely on external confirmation. You are not searching for what to do in the same way. You are recognizing what aligns with your understanding and moving accordingly. And that recognition becomes more consistent the more you trust it, the more you allow it to guide you without second-guessing every step. This does not mean you become rigid or inflexible. It means you become grounded, able to adapt without losing your sense of direction, able to respond to new information without abandoning your clarity. And this grounding is what stabilizes your awareness, allowing it to function effectively without being overwhelmed by the complexity it perceives. You are not trying to control everything you see. You are understanding it, integrating it, using it as a reference point for how you engage with the world. And this is where the idea of value becomes fully realized, not as something external that can be measured or assigned, but as something internal that shapes your entire experience. Something that influences how you move, how you decide, how you interact in ways that are consistent and intentional. You are no longer operating from the same level as before, not in a hierarchical sense, but in a perceptual sense, because your awareness has expanded beyond what is immediately visible. And that expansion changes everything about how you navigate your environment. And once you recognize this, once you understand that what you carry is not something superficial, but something deeply functional, something that influences every aspect of your engagement with reality, the idea of its price becomes less about what it is worth to others and more about how it shapes your own path. Because it is this awareness that will continue to guide you, to refine your perception, to align your actions with your understanding in ways that remain consistent regardless of external conditions. And that consistency is what gives it lasting significance. Not as something that needs to be displayed or proven, but as something that is lived, integrated, and carried forward with every step you take. And as your clarity continues to stabilize and your awareness becomes something you rely on rather than something you question, you begin to notice a subtle but important shift in how the environments around you respond. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in small changes in behavior, in tone, in the way certain interactions unfold, as if the patterns that once operated smoothly now encounter a kind of quiet resistance, simply because they are no longer moving unnoticed. And this is where you begin to understand why awareness, especially consistent and grounded awareness, can feel unsettling to systems or groups that depend on predictability. Because what they rely on most is not control in an overt sense, but continuity, repetition, the ability to function without interruption. And awareness introduces something that disrupts that continuity without needing to confront it directly. You are not opposing anything in a visible way. You are not interfering with what is happening on the surface. But your ability to recognize patterns changes how you engage with them. And that change, though subtle, is enough to alter the flow of those patterns. Because they are no longer interacting with someone who responds automatically. They are interacting with someone who observes, who pauses, who chooses their response based on understanding rather than habit. And this is where the idea of fear begins to make sense. Not as something dramatic or emotional, but as a functional reaction to unpredictability. Because systems that rely on repetition function best when responses are consistent, when behavior follows expected patterns, when interactions can be anticipated and managed within a known structure. But awareness disrupts that predictability. It introduces variation. It creates a level of independence that cannot be easily accounted for within those patterns. You may begin to notice how certain interactions feel different now, how there is a slight shift in how people respond to you, how certain dynamics that once felt smooth now carry a subtle tension. Not because you are doing anything differently on the surface, but because your engagement is no longer aligned with unconscious repetition. And that misalignment creates a kind of friction that is difficult to define, but easy to sense. This does not mean that everything around you is reacting consciously or intentionally. Much of it happens at a level that is not fully articulated, but the effect is still there. Because patterns recognize when they are not being followed, even if that recognition is not expressed directly. You are no longer as easily guided by cues that once influenced your behavior. You are less responsive to subtle signals that once shaped your decisions. And this reduction in influence changes how those patterns interact with you, because they can no longer rely on the same level of predictability. And this is where your awareness becomes more than just observation. It becomes a form of stability, because you are not being pulled in multiple directions by conflicting influences. You are grounded in your understanding, able to remain consistent even when the environment around you shifts. This consistency is not rigidity, it is alignment. It is the result of knowing how to navigate without being carried by every external signal. And that alignment is what creates independence. Not in isolation, but in perception. Because you are able to engage with the same environment while maintaining your own direction within it. You may also begin to see how truth itself functions in this context. Not as something that needs to be declared or proven in every situation, but as something that becomes evident through consistency. Through the way patterns reveal themselves over time. Through the way awareness allows you to see what is actually happening, rather than what appears to be happening on the surface. Truth does not need to force itself into visibility. It emerges naturally when observation is consistent, when attention is sustained, when perception is allowed to develop without being constrained by immediate assumptions. And this is why awareness has such a profound effect. Because it aligns you with what is real, rather than what is merely presented. And once that alignment is established, it becomes difficult to be influenced by patterns that rely on surface-level engagement. You are no longer reacting to appearances. You are responding to underlying structures. And that shift changes everything about how you interact with the world. You may still participate in the same systems, the same environments, the same interactions, but you do so with a level of clarity that allows you to navigate rather than be guided without awareness. And this navigation is what creates a sense of control, not over others, but over your own engagement, your own direction, your own decisions. And as you continue to operate from this level, you may notice that your presence itself begins to carry a different kind of influence. Not because you are trying to influence anything directly, but because your clarity affects how interactions unfold, how decisions are made, how situations develop in your presence. You are no longer just part of the pattern. You are interacting with it from a place of awareness. And that interaction changes the dynamic, because it introduces a level of unpredictability that cannot be easily absorbed into the existing structure. This is why awareness can feel threatening to systems that rely on consistency, not because it opposes them directly, but because it reduces their ability to function without recognition. And recognition is what limits unconscious influence. You are not breaking anything. You are seeing it. And that seeing is enough to change how it operates in relation to you. This is also where your understanding of independence deepens, because it is no longer about separating yourself from everything around you. It is about engaging with it consciously, about choosing how you participate rather than being carried by patterns you do not recognize. You may still move through the same environments, interact with the same people, encounter the same structures, but your relationship to them is different because you are aware of how they function. And that awareness allows you to maintain your alignment regardless of external conditions. And this alignment is what protects your clarity, because it prevents you from being pulled back into unconscious patterns. It allows you to remain consistent in your perception even when the environment around you continues to operate as it always has. You are not trying to change everything. You are understanding it. And that understanding is what gives you the ability to navigate without being overwhelmed or influenced in ways you do not recognize. And as this continues to develop, you begin to see that what you once perceived as external pressure or tension is often simply the result of this shift in awareness, the natural response of patterns adjusting to the presence of someone who no longer engages with them in the same way. And once you understand that, it becomes easier to remain grounded, to continue observing without reacting unnecessarily, to maintain your clarity without needing to confront or oppose what you see. You are not here to disrupt for the sake of disruption. You are here to see, to understand, to navigate with awareness that allows you to move through complexity with stability. And that stability is what ensures that your clarity remains intact, that it continues to guide you without being shaken by the reactions or adjustments that occur around you. And this is where everything begins to align more clearly, because you are no longer questioning why things feel different. You are understanding that difference as a natural result of your awareness, as a sign that you are no longer operating at the same level of unconscious engagement. And that understanding allows you to move forward with confidence, not in a loud or forceful way, but in a quiet, steady way that does not need validation to remain strong. because it is grounded in what you see, what you understand, and how you choose to engage with it moving forward. And as your awareness continues to mature into something stable and consistent, something that no longer flickers between doubt and clarity, but instead holds its ground even when the environment around you shifts, there comes a point where the role you occupy within that environment begins to change. Not because you announced it, not because you demanded it, but because the way you see and the way you move can no longer remain unnoticed at the subtle levels where patterns operate and recognize deviation from what they expect. You may not have intended to stand out. You may not have tried to position yourself differently. But awareness has a way of making itself visible through behavior, through choices, through the absence of automatic responses. And that visibility, even when quiet, begins to alter how you are perceived within the systems you move through. This is where the shift from observer to someone who is being observed in return begins to unfold. Not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in small, almost imperceptible changes that accumulate over time. Changes in how certain interactions feel, in how certain people respond, in how certain situations seem to hold a different kind of attention when you are present. You may begin to notice that your presence carries a kind of weight that was not there before. Not because you are doing more, but because you are engaging differently. Because you are no longer blending seamlessly into patterns that rely on predictability. And that difference, though subtle, is enough to draw attention at levels that are not always consciously acknowledged. It is not about being targeted in a direct sense. It is about being recognized as someone who does not follow the same flow. Someone whose responses are not as easily anticipated. Someone whose perception introduces variation into systems that function best when variation is minimized. And this recognition does not always manifest in obvious ways. It can appear as increased curiosity, as subtle shifts in tone, as a heightened awareness from others that something about your engagement is different, even if they cannot fully articulate what it is. You may notice how certain conversations take a slightly different direction when you are involved, how certain dynamics adjust in response to your presence, how certain people become more attentive, more cautious, or more curious without a clear reason. And while these changes may be easy to dismiss individually, together they form a pattern that reflects this shift in your role. From someone who observes quietly to someone whose awareness is now part of the environment itself. This is where it becomes important to remain grounded, because the awareness you have developed is not meant to pull you into unnecessary reaction. It is meant to guide you in how you move within this new dynamic, how you maintain your clarity without being influenced by the changes in attention that may arise. You are not here to respond to every subtle shift, not here to interpret every change as something that requires action. You are here to continue observing, to continue understanding, to allow your awareness to remain steady, regardless of how the environment responds to it. This is where discipline becomes essential, not in the sense of restriction, but in the sense of consistency, the ability to remain aligned with your perception without being pulled into reactions that disrupt that alignment. You may feel moments where the increased attention creates a sense of pressure, where the awareness that you are being noticed in new ways introduces a layer of complexity that was not present before. But this is where your grounding comes into play, because you understand that this shift is a natural result of your awareness, not something that needs to be resisted or amplified, but something that needs to be navigated with the same clarity that brought you here. You are still the observer, but now you are also part of what is being observed. And that dual role requires a balance, the ability to maintain your perspective while also being aware of how your presence influences the environment around you. This does not mean you become self-conscious or overly focused on how you are perceived. It means you remain aware without losing your center. You continue to engage with intention rather than reaction. You allow your awareness to guide your actions rather than allowing external responses to dictate them. And as you continue to move in this way, you begin to see that this shift does not limit you. It expands your understanding. Because it allows you to observe not only the patterns around you, but also how those patterns adjust in response to awareness, how they respond to deviation, how they attempt to maintain their structure even when variation is introduced. You are no longer just studying the system from within it. You are observing how it responds to your presence within it. And that adds another layer to your understanding. One that reveals not only how patterns operate, but how they adapt, how they react, how they attempt to recalibrate when something does not align with their expectations. This deeper level of observation requires patience, because these responses are not always immediate or obvious. They unfold over time, through repeated interactions, through subtle shifts that only become clear when you maintain consistent awareness. You are not looking for immediate confirmation. You are allowing the pattern to reveal itself through continuity, just as it did when you first began to notice it. And this patience is what keeps your perception aligned, because it prevents you from reacting prematurely, from drawing conclusions that are not yet fully supported by what you observe. You are moving with the process, not ahead of it, allowing your understanding to deepen naturally as you continue to engage with your environment. You may also begin to notice how your own behavior becomes more refined, not in a forced way, but in a natural way that reflects your awareness. How you choose your responses more intentionally, how you engage with situations more selectively, how you maintain a level of composure that allows you to remain clear even when the environment becomes more complex. This refinement is not about control. It is about alignment. It is the result of understanding how to navigate without being pulled into unnecessary reactions, how to maintain your clarity without needing to assert it in every situation. You are not here to prove that you see. You are here to continue seeing, to continue understanding, to allow that understanding to guide you in ways that are consistent and stable. And as this continues to unfold, you begin to realize that the shift from observer to someone who is also observed is not a loss of position. It is an expansion of it. It is an indication that your awareness has reached a level where it interacts with the environment in a way that cannot remain entirely unnoticed. And that interaction is what allows you to understand not only the patterns themselves, but how they respond to awareness, how they adjust, how they attempt to maintain their structure in the presence of someone who sees them clearly. And this understanding is what allows you to navigate this stage with confidence. Not because you control everything that happens, but because you understand how to remain aligned within it, how to continue observing without being pulled off balance, how to allow your awareness to remain the foundation of your engagement regardless of how the environment responds. You are not stepping into something unfamiliar. You are expanding within what you already understand. And that expansion is what will continue to guide you as you move forward, allowing you to maintain your clarity, your stability, and your awareness even as the dynamics around you continue to evolve in response to your presence. And as everything you have come to understand begins to settle into something more stable, something that no longer feels like a series of discoveries, but instead feels like a way of seeing that you now carry naturally, there comes a final and essential shift. One that is not about seeing more, but about learning how to remain grounded while seeing what you now see. Because awareness without stability can easily turn into overreaction, into unnecessary tension, into a state where clarity is clouded, not by lack of understanding, but by the way it is handled. This is where your discipline is no longer about observation alone. It is about how you hold what you observe, how you carry it without letting it disrupt your sense of balance, how you allow it to guide you without allowing it to overwhelm you. You begin to understand that not everything you notice requires immediate action. Not every pattern you recognize needs to be confronted or even addressed directly. Because part of true awareness is knowing when to engage and when to simply observe, when to move and when to remain still, when to act and when to allow the situation to unfold without interference. This restraint is not weakness, it is precision. It is the ability to respond with intention rather than impulse. And that precision is what keeps your clarity intact, even as the complexity around you continues to evolve. You are no longer reacting to everything you see. You are selecting your responses based on alignment, based on understanding, based on whether engagement is necessary or whether observation alone is enough. And this selection process becomes more natural the more you trust your awareness, because you begin to recognize that clarity is not about constant action. It is about accurate perception followed by appropriate response. And sometimes the most appropriate response is simply to remain grounded, to allow what you see to exist without needing to change it. You may notice that the more stable you become in this way, the less external fluctuations affect you, the less you are pulled into the emotional or reactive states that once might have accompanied uncertainty, because your awareness now provides a reference point that remains steady regardless of what is happening around you. You are not dependent on everything being clear at all times. You are comfortable allowing things to reveal themselves gradually. You are able to sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately, because you trust that your perception will continue to guide you as more information becomes available. This trust is what anchors you, what allows you to move through complexity without losing your center, what prevents your awareness from becoming a source of stress rather than a source of clarity. And as you continue to operate from this grounded state, you begin to see that your presence itself becomes more stable, more consistent, less reactive to external shifts. And this stability not only supports your own clarity, it also influences how you interact with the environment. Because you are no longer contributing to unnecessary fluctuation, you are maintaining a level of balance that allows you to navigate with intention rather than reaction. You are not here to carry the weight of everything you see. You are here to understand it, to move through it with awareness that remains aligned with your own direction, your own clarity, your own sense of stability. And this is where everything comes together, where your observation, your understanding, and your grounding merge into a way of being that is consistent, reliable, and aligned with the level of awareness you have developed, allowing you to continue forward without being pulled back into the patterns you have already recognized, allowing you to engage with the world in a way that reflects not just what you see, but how you choose to carry it, with calm, with precision, with a clarity that remains steady no matter what unfolds around you. And as everything you have moved through begins to settle into a clearer understanding, what once felt like a series of disconnected realizations now reveals itself as a continuous path, one that has been shaping your perception step by step, guiding you from subtle awareness into something far more grounded and deliberate. And in this moment, you begin to see that nothing you noticed was without purpose. Nothing you questioned was wasted. Nothing you sensed was meaningless. Because each piece contributed to a level of clarity that you now carry with a quiet certainty that does not need to be announced to exist. You are no longer standing at the edge of confusion, trying to figure out what is real and what is not. You have crossed into a space where your awareness itself becomes your reference point, where your ability to observe and understand is something you trust rather than something you constantly doubt. And that shift changes everything about how you move forward from here. There may still be moments where the world around you feels complex, where patterns continue to unfold in ways that require patience to fully understand, where not everything is immediately clear. But the difference now is that you are not lost within that complexity. You are navigating it. You are engaging with it from a place of stability that allows you to remain centered even when everything else is shifting. You are not here to prove what you see, not here to convince those who are not yet ready to recognize what you have come to understand. You are here to continue aligning with your awareness, to move with the clarity that has been built through your own observation, your own discipline, your own willingness to look beyond the surface when it would have been easier not to. And as you continue forward, there is a quiet strength in knowing that what you carry cannot be taken from you, because it is not something external. It is not dependent on validation or agreement. It is something that has been formed within you, something that continues to grow the more you trust it, the more you live from it. This is not an ending. It is a continuation, a deeper level of engagement with the same awareness that brought you here. And from this point on, you are no longer searching for clarity. You are moving with it, allowing it to shape your path in ways that remain steady, intentional, and aligned with everything you have come to understand.